What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 meta decks for the July 2018 format. The reason I want to bring this to you guys is, the format's kind of coming to a close, and if you have any local tournaments or maybe some larger tournaments that might be taking place that aren't exactly on the regional scene, I want to give you guys an idea of what decks you should expect to be going up against. Now, this list is pretty much going to extend all the way into August as well, because that's where we're going to be getting our new ban list, and even though Cybernetic Horizon comes out at the end of the month, it's not really going to have the biggest impact on the current format, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But before we get into the list, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout outs today to Jericho as well as Amber. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off with number 5, when I take the time to compile this list, there's some choices that are more obvious than others, but for this format, when I actually had to figure out what the number 5 deck was going to be, that was actually the most difficult, because there could be an argument to be made for a lot of different decks that could be in this slot, because the first decks, the decks towards the top of the list, it's a bit more obvious, but when you get further down the ladder, it actually becomes a lot more difficult. But that deck, I'm gonna have to give it to Burning Abyss. Burning Abyss is a really interesting deck because even though it didn't really start off in this format very strong, once it became relevant in the format, basically due in part to Thomas Rose at the UK Nationals, it really took off and influenced how the rest of the format really shaped up, and we've seen a prolific effect of Burning Abyss just pretty much just laying claim to all these other events and really making its impact on a lot of these top cut slots, and I think Burning Abyss rightfully deserves this. Now, what are the advantages of Burning Abyss in this current format? Well, it doesn't exactly lose to hand traps because Ash Blossom, there's a couple good cards you could hit, like, maybe a Sekka's Light or a Tour Guide. Beyond that, though, you don't really have many good Ash targets. Draw and Lockbird almost does nothing against the deck, so that's a pretty good plus. So being able to blank some of your opponent's cards that pretty much every meta deck's going to be playing is a very strong advantage. The deck's also rather consistent. I mean, there's so many multiple 2 and 3 card combinations to get you into a Beatrice turn 1 that's pretty good. And even if you're going second, because of the recursive ability of the Burning Abyss cards, you have the ability to kind of just kamikaze your monsters into your opponent, and you really don't feel too bad about it because they're going to be wasting resources to stop your plays, but you're going to generate all those resources back anyway, and that's kind of how Dante and Burning Abyss has really been able to just thrive for years on end. And the other thing is that Burning Abyss can play a ton of hand traps as well. Sekka's Light kind of brought the deck into a whole new light by essentially adding 3 Pot of Greeds into the deck, and even though you can't play spells or traps, hand traps kind of fill that void and are essentially better versions of those cards anyway because they're not susceptible to spell and trap removal. But being able to play a ton of hand traps, especially in a format dominated by some of the other decks you're going to see on this list, definitely has its advantages and can really slow those decks down just enough so that the recursive ability of your Burning Abyss monsters can outgrind your opponent and start to win you games. Burning Abyss also just kind of has some good matchups across the board. Sure, you have to worry about stuff like Abyss Dweller, maybe even Borolo Dragon for your Beatrice. There's very specific cards that are very, just good against Burning Abyss in general, but realistically, it's just a very well-rounded deck, and it's probably one of the cheaper decks on the entire list. So if you're looking for something fun to play this summer and still have a good competitive chance, I definitely say Burning Abyss rightfully deserves that number 5 slot. But this brings us on to number 4, and for number 4, we have Pendulum Magician. Yeah, I had to give it to Pendulum Magician because it's probably been topping at about a similar rate as Burning Abyss, but the thing is it's been seeing a lot more success in just how far it's been able to make it in those top cuts. I mean, hell, it made it to 2nd place of the North American WCQ, it won the South American WCQ, and it also made it pretty far in the European WCQ as well, I believe, or maybe the UK National, but it's basically made its presence known. Now, the thing about Pendulum Magician is that it does have some parallels with Burning Abyss. I mean, again, it's another deck that doesn't really lose to hand traps. There's a few select cards that Ash Blossom's good against, but realistically, that's every deck. Draw and Lockbird really doesn't do anything to harm the deck in the slightest. The deck is ultra consistent because you're basically playing a ton of combo Pendulum cards and basically just trying to just dump them all onto the board, just vomit out a field that's basically nearly indestructible to your opponent by having Vortex Dragon, Naruto, you got Jiangshi Magician, you got Mystical Beast, Jackal King. There's so many good, just big, strong monsters that also have built-in effect negation that's very difficult for your opponent to kind of handle that all at once. And then you have the recursive ability of the Pendulum summoning mechanic itself, giving the deck a lot to really deal with, because even if you deal with their monsters on the board, if you don't deal with the Pendulum scales, they're just going to Pendulum summon it all back on the following turn, and then you're going to have a really difficult time. The deck does have its weaknesses, especially when you're going into games 2 and 3 and considering the side deck, and especially because the side deck cards for Pendulum Magician are also very good against other cards that are just in the meta in general. But the thing you have to realize is the fact that the deck has seen as much success as it has, and it has an extraordinarily good matchup against, I would say, pretty much every deck on this list, which are the top meta decks of this format. I think the biggest downside is it's weakest against my number one deck of this format, and that's definitely a big issue, but being well-rounded enough for every single other deck and falling a little bit short, maybe having to rely on your side deck games 2 and 3, you know, that's something you're going to have to consider, but I still definitely makes Pendulum Magician worthy of that number 4 slot. Now this moves us on to number 3, and for number 3, I've never felt more confident about placing a deck in this number 3 slot, and that deck's gonna have to be Pure Sky Striker. You know, Pure Sky Striker is kind of the deck that every single time I do a meta analysis and I show you guys the pie charts, it's always hanging out there, and you know, it's there and people know that it tops, but people aren't really too excited about it. It's like, yeah, Sky Striker, you know, it made the top 8 or made the top 4, but yeah, that's kind of where it ends. I mean, it's a super heavy control deck, which isn't a bad thing, but the fact that you have those new end-of-match procedures really hindering the deck's ability to perform, especially in those end-of-match procedures, really kind of just puts a damper on the deck's ability to do well, especially in longer tournaments. Now, I've been talking about Cybernetic Horizon and the fact that I don't think it's going to have a tremendous impact on the format, but if there's one deck it will impact, it's Pure Sky Striker, and that's because of 2 cards, Sky Striker Ace Hayate and Borrelsword Dragon. Now, Hayate's really good because it essentially increases the consistency of the deck exponentially by helping you get to your Sky Striker engage that much quicker. It sends it from deck to grave, but then you can just tag out into Gagari, add it to your hand, and sometimes when you're playing Pure Sky Striker, you can really live or die by whether or not you can get an engage online. So Hayate helps fix that. It also just gives you another monster in general to tag out into. We kind of saw with Zodiac when it got Chakanine, it just kind of took the deck to another level, and I think Hayate is going to have a similar effect. I mean, there's a reason it's the best deck in Japan, but obviously there's some little bit of difference in between our 2 formats. But Borrelsword Dragon also is a very powerful card as well. Now, I understand we don't have Crystal Needle Fiber, but it just kind of gives the deck another layer and just something else that it can really do. Having a Sky Striker Ace monster plus a Borrelsword Dragon is a pretty deadly combination, especially in tandem with all the rest of the cards that the Sky Striker deck has to offer. And even though we don't have Needle Fiber to make that insane 2-card OTK, I still think it's going to be an incredible asset for the deck and something you really want to look out for. Now moving on to the number 2 slot, we've got Sky Striker Trickstar. So Sky Striker Trickstar, while it is the most represented deck of the format, especially when you look at all of the Nationals and the WCQs we've had up to this point, it's obvious that the deck has a lot of presence, but isn't necessarily the best deck. I don't think so. I think that our number 1 deck has obviously taken its place, and that's not necessarily saying that Sky Striker Trickstar is a bad deck. I think the deck is very consistent, and the deck can do a lot of really cool things. I think Sky Striker Trickstar just falls short in a couple categories and does things that aren't as unfair as our number 1 deck, but you still have a very well-rounded deck, especially in how you decide to build it. You've got a deck that has 2 extremely powerful engines, an aggressive engine and a control-based engine, and when you meld the 2 together, it kind of just creates this harmonious relationship that just happens to work. And even though it does have its weaknesses and falls short in a couple categories, maybe it has a reliance on Scapegoat, or, you know, maybe it just has the fact that it's not strong enough to push over really big boards, it does still do well for the deck that it is. And I think the fact that we've seen so much representation of this deck, and especially since it's been dominating the top cuts of the WCQs and these national championships that have been taking place around the world, you really can't discount the fact that Trickstar Sky Striker is still a very formidable threat, and until we get a ban list, I definitely think it's still going to remain the number 2 deck of the format. But that brings us on to our number 1 deck, and if you haven't already figured it out, that deck is Goki. I think Goki has kind of taken on a new just form and evolution at this point in the current format, especially with the introduction of cards like Neospatian Aqua Dolphin, the shift over to the rank 3 build utilizing MX Saber Invoker, which makes the deck a lot more consistent and not as susceptible to a lot of the cards that could be disrupting it. But because you have cards like Aqua Dolphin, Called by the Grave, hell, some players are even opting for Drag Down by the Grave just so they can get every hand trap out of their opponent's hand, and since you really only need 2 warrior monsters, or I guess even 2 level 3 monsters in this case, to essentially fully extra link your opponent, that's why I had to place this deck in the number 1 category. I mean, it won the North American WCQ, it won the European WCQ, and I really think that speaks volumes in terms of how powerful this deck is. Even though the deck itself doesn't necessarily FTK, the fact that you're extra linking your opponent is almost an FTK in itself, because a lot of decks have a very difficult time breaking that board and playing without having the opportunity to utilize the extra monster zone. And then you've got stuff like Gumblar Dragon ripping cards out of your opponent's hand if they want to take a different route. The deck is ultra consistent because there's so many starter cards and extender cards, and since you only need those 2 warriors, very similar to a deck like Spiral trying to achieve its Spiral Double Helix, that's basically just the bread and butter of the deck, and it does it very well. But then you also have the fact that all the Goki monsters replace themselves, and yeah, sure, you've got stuff like Sphere Mode and all these other random cards to worry about that might break your board, but because we have cards now that basically allow us to have the insight into our opponent's hand to rip those cards out before they become problematic, I think that's why I had to put Goki at the number 1 slot. But even with these 5 decks, there's still plenty of other decks that have not only been able to top some of the most prestigious events of this format, but realistically are still very viable options, especially at the local level. I mean, you've got stuff like Altergeist, you've got Spiral, you've got Dinosaur, you've got Paleozoic, True Draco. These are all very strong decks that are still very good contenders, especially for tournaments that are only going to last for 4 to 5 rounds, depending on how big your locals is. So if you don't want to play any of the top 5 meta decks here, just play some of the other ones I suggested, and you're still going to have a very good shot at seeing a lot of competitive success. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this top 5 list. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.